Namatjira's legacy as the foremost Indigenous painter of his generation has endured, despite the divided opinions of his contemporary critics. His work has been acknowledged by British royalty, hung in the drawing rooms of the Megurk and exhibited worldwide. His coveted, creviced landscapes of valleys, copses and boundary riverbeds, with their softened palettes of primary colors that defy caricature of the desert and its harsh light, sell for hundreds of thousands of dollars on the rare occasions they come under the auctioneer's hammer. The sidelines of associated merchandise, postcards, tea towels, biscuits tins, for example, are worth a fortune in themselves. So it is shocking, perhaps astonishing to some, that Namatjira's Arrernte family should, for several generations, have endured intense poverty because they did not own the copyright to his work. But it should not be at all surprising given the Commonwealth of Australia's historic and ongoing treatment of its Indigenous people, even those it has regarded as appropriately assimilated or culturally exceptional by its own norms. The vaults of museums and auction houses the world over are bursting with the priceless works of some of the finest artists in the world, taken on completion before the paint could dry or traded in exchange for tobacco. Their only legacy now, in the communities from which they were appropriated, is a generational addiction to tobacco with all its associated disease and suffering. But the copyright to Namatjira's works has finally transferred to his grandchildren. It followed a long battle between, on the one side, the family and their pro bono legal representatives Arnold Bloch Liebler, the social change organization Big Heart and leading cultural institutions, and, on the other, Legend Press, a non-Indigenous Sydney art publisher that has enjoyed majority or full control of Namatjira's copyright for 6 decades. The continuous pressure from the family and its supporters, coupled with the recent intervention by the entrepreneur Dick Smith, a childhood friend of the Brackenragh family that owns Legend Press, and the campaigning journalism of Rosemary Neal of The Australian and the ABC's Daniel Browning, resulted in a deal late last week to transfer the copyright to the artist's descendants. The arrangement will be worth, potentially, millions of dollars to the Namatjira clan and their community. It will also give them, through the Namatjira Legacy Trust, control over how copies of the painter's work are commercially, or otherwise, used in, for example, catalogues for his exhibited paintings. The family and some galleries has argued that such use has been at best highly restrictive. It is a wonderful result for Namatjira's legacy and, of course, his people. But it is also a salient reminder of just how oppressive post-colonial Australian society was for Indigenous people less than an average white lifetime ago, how pitifully slowly things have changed, and of the enduring inequity between black and white Australia. Namatjira. The issue of the painter's copyright has always been a question of Indigenous agency. Photograph Pastors So Gross, courtesy Strelo Research Center, supplied Big Heart the complex story of how the Namatjira copyright was sold in full to Legend in 1983 after, in 1957, the artist having entered an agreement with the then principal of Legend, John Brackenragh, for a 12% royalty by the Northern Territory Public Trustee, has been well told. The then public advocate has even publicly expressed his regret at the 1983 sale of the Namatjira copyright for $8,500, which was made without any consultation of the family. While the long tussle over the copyright has pitted moral against legal rights, the central, and sometimes, perhaps, overlooked, issue has always been the fundamental denial of Indigenous agency. For it is hard to imagine that Australia would ever permit the family of any non-Indigenous artist of Namatjira's cultural stature to be treated accordingly in the 1950s, let alone the 1980s. White Australia, as it then, in the 50s, knew itself, had embraced Namatjira, to a point. It's often said he operated between two worlds, black and white, as one of the first Indigenous people to be granted citizenship and, hypothetically at least, its associated privileges. His embrace of some white fella painting techniques to bring his watercolors a more actual or literal interpretation of country as opposed to earlier more figurative Indigenous paintings, that so appealed to ethnologists and anthropologists of creationist stories and myth, drew European eyes. But they also inspired occasional critics among some of his people, who thought he should stick with his more traditional painterly and craft roots, and the white salons and academies who unfairly dismissed his work as derivative. Namatjira's life played out tragically. But the resolution of his copyright restores appropriate dignity to his legacy and justice to his family. It is not, however, the end. Indigenous art and culture more broadly, story in all its forms including visual art, has been appropriated since first colonial contact. If the story of Namatjira's copyright has a broader resonance, it is that sadly many other Indigenous creators will probably never, in life or posthumously, be afforded such agency. Paul Daley is a Guardian Australia columnist.